Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Global Risk to the EU is a large-scale survey designed to quantify expert perception of conflict-related threats to European Union security. To explore what to watch for and what threatens the EU, I spoke with Eric Johns, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. We discussed the likelihood of various scenarios, identify what are the high, moderate, and remote risks for the European Union, examine how these risks are connected to Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, and also what the EU faces internally. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Eric, can you describe the global risks to the EU project? Why did you decide to launch it?
The project actually is something that we decided to develop having looked at what's called the Preventative Priorities Survey at the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. And talking with Paul Stairs, who runs that project at the Council on Foreign Relations, we realized that it would be very useful to do something in a similar basis, surveying experts to try to get a sense of what are the main priorities looking ahead, but from a European perspective. We've worked very closely with the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States to make sure that we're asking similar questions, but obviously not all the same questions. And we try to find a way to make sure that we do our survey at roughly the same period of time and that we hit roughly the same sample size, which is between 500 and 600 experts on either side of the Atlantic, so that we end up with results that are comparable and that speak to one another, but that also provide insights that are important for European policymakers.
To what extent is the project about forecasting risks and predicting the future?
Let me put it to you this way. Every policymaker and every investor and every business person who wants to make an investment or build a business or set a policy has to predict the future to a greater or lesser extent. And we're doing no different in this context. And what we're asking our experts to give us a sense of is their assessment of what is the likelihood and what is the impact of 30 different scenarios that we believe are relevant to European interests. So to take one that's very topical right now, the United States and Russia have been negotiating over peace in Ukraine. The question is whether the Europeans will be able to influence the deal sufficiently, or Ukrainians will be able to influence the deal sufficiently to make sure that if the deal is agreed and or imposed on Ukraine, it's a good deal, right? So it's worth asking our experts, do you think that it's likely that it will be a bad deal? And if it is a bad deal, do you think that the impact will be significant or not? And for the second year in a row, our experts have identified the likelihood of a bad deal as being among the highest risks that the EU faces, but also the impact of a bad deal as being among the highest risks that the EU faces. And when you put those likelihood and impact together, that's what we really want to focus policymakers' attention on.
I want to come back to this potential peace deal, but first, let me ask you something different. You discuss three categories: high risks, moderate risks, and remote risk. I would like to focus especially on the high risks, but the moderate risk category mentions the possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. As I said, it is listed as a moderate rather than a high risk, but even moderate sounds extremely alarming, don't you think?
The first thing that you should realize is that the use of nuclear weapons by any country is extremely alarming. And it's extremely alarming because we know the impact would be extraordinary. But then what is the likelihood? And what we're going in these moderate risks are things that are either very high impact, but relatively low likelihood, and that would be Russia using nuclear weapons, or very high likelihood, but relatively lower impact. And that would be something like a breakdown in the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, we don't want to see any of these things happen, but we're trying to put for policymakers into a context where they can compare what look to everybody else like apples and oranges. But for policymakers, they have to be similar enough so that policymakers can redeploy resources from those things that have the highest combination of likelihood and impact, and away from those things where the likelihood and impact is probably lower, even though these things are all important. And here I should emphasize, none of the 30 surveys that we offered are unimportant. They're all things that policymakers have to think about. It's just within the world where everything is important, policymakers still have to make choices where they're going to focus their attention.
So when we are talking about those categories, high risk means that the very high likelihood and also very high impact. And remote risk means relatively low or very low likelihood and also very low impact. Am I right?
Yeah, I would agree with your first usage, which is relatively low, right? Again, these are all important issues, but relative to the threat of nuclear first use by Russia, the impact from many things is lower. And relative to the breakdown of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the likelihood of many of these things is lower, but that doesn't mean they're unlikely, and it doesn't mean they're not impactful.
You mentioned this already, Eric, but as you wrote in your project summary, Russia-related scenarios remain at the core of EU security concerns. EU security is directly threatened by a peace deal that would lock in territorial gains for Moscow, reward aggression, and undermine Ukraine's long-term viability as a sovereign democratic state. And so-called Russian peace would also signal that the EU cannot shape its own security environment or deter future threats from Russia. Do you think the EU, Europe, and Ukraine will be able to avoid a peace deal that favors Russia, especially if a Donald Trump administration, it seems, pushes for a deal at any cost?
What our experts are saying is that this is very possible that we will face this kind of a negotiation solution that's not beneficial to Europe or to Ukraine. And I would put probably the ordering in a different way, not beneficial to Ukraine or to Europe. In that ordering, the reason we want to emphasize that this is what our experts are so concerned about is precisely to devote as much energy as possible to avoid that situation. Obviously, it's a situation we may confront, but as European policymakers, I think they have an obligation to try to avoid that situation to the best extent that they can. And our experts are all agreeing with policymakers in giving that the priority for European action, along with other things like preventing a U.S. withdrawal from its security guarantees to Europe, which may be unavoidable, or preventing Russian military action against countries that are not in NATO, but nevertheless border on Europe. Again, this is something that is very possible. Or, and this is what was most striking in the survey, preventing a hybrid attack on European infrastructure. And Russia is not explicitly identified in that, but clearly Russia is the most active non-European entity in attacking European infrastructure through drone attacks on airports, through the dredging up of undersea cables. And our experts have identified this as not only the most likely, but also among the most impactful of risks that European policymakers are going to have to face.
You mentioned that the bad deal would be detrimental for Ukraine, for Europe, but, my question also would be, so wouldn't be the bad deal also detrimental for the US? No matter what the Trump administration is trying to do, I don't believe that it is really in the US interest to give Russia what Russia wants. Don't you think so?
I mean, there are many ways, Andre, to calculate US interests. And what is interesting about the Trump administration is that the Trump administration likes to calculate US interest in terms of the potential for business partnerships to flow from a series of different policy actions. And if you look at the structure of the deal they're proposing with Ukraine, it is rich with opportunities for U.S. businesses to gain by breaking new ground in their relationship with Russia and indeed extracting and developing resources from Ukraine. Now, the problem with that is the Trump administration may believe that's America's best interest, but you or I would probably disagree. And I suspect many of the experts that are surveyed by the Council on Foreign Relations would disagree as well, because most people in the foreign policy community in the United States believe that a bad deal for Ukraine is a bad deal for the United States. And very few agree with the strategy of the Trump administration to pursue a deal that's good for a very slender slice of U.S. business interests. But, unfortunately, Trump is calling the shots on this. It's his interpretation of American national interest that sort of prevails in the setting of U.S. policy.
I think there are three potential scenarios in the high-risk category, and basically you already described them. U.S. withdrawal from security guarantees to European allies, and new Russian military action against non-NATO neighboring states, and a disruptive hybrid attack on EU critical infrastructure. Even though Russia is not mentioned there explicitly, we know who is doing what. But what if we combine these scenarios? And I think it's very easy to combine them. Basically, I think we even see the combination of these scenarios. Would that constitute a perfect security storm for Europe?
Unfortunately, Andre, these scenarios are all connected, right? So they're not independent scenarios that we throw out that are uncorrelated one with another. And so it's unsurprising that we're seeing them all float to the top at the same time, because Russia has a foreign policy that is determined to undermine European security and to put European unity at risk. When I say European unity, they're not planning on invading Europe or bombing Europe into the Stone Age, but they certainly would like to weaken the European Union to the greatest extent to which they can. And that's why they're pursuing all of these different avenues, encouraging the United States to withdraw from its security guarantee, engaging in a hybrid warfare that attacks European infrastructure, engaging in military action with non-NATO neighboring states, often in a hybrid form in those countries as well, and pushing for this very bad deal for Ukraine that would be brokered with the United States. I mean, all of this is part of a piece in the tragedy is that the U.S. administration, which is seeing exactly the same universe that we're seeing, right? They don't live in an alternate reality, are interpreting this in very different ways and with a very different calculation of national interest for the United States.
I would probably argue that at least some of them live in an alternate reality, but that would be for another discussion. So let me focus on the global risk. A cross-strait military conflict between China and Taiwan is also listed in the high-risk category. I must admit that I would not personally place it among the highest risks, but of course, it's a possibility. How do you see this?
Well, again, Andre, if you look at the high risks to the EU, what you'll see is that China-Taiwan has the lowest likelihood, but it has a very high impact. And that's why it moves up into this top category. Of those top category things, it has the lowest likelihood of them all. And I think most experts would agree that we're more likely to see what we're seeing, a continuation of Russian foreign policy and its aggressive posture toward Europe, than we are to see China exercise an aggressive posture toward Taiwan. But having said that, there is concern. And we all know that the impact of a conflict across the Taiwan Straits would be enormous for Europe's economy, not least because of our dependence on access to high-end chips from Taiwanese chip manufacturers. So I think there's a lot of concern that needs to be devoted to that. And what's interesting about this particular scenario is how far away from Europe it is. Most of the other scenarios are very close to Europe, but this scenario, very far away, very important for European policymakers to focus their attention on.
I would also argue that, again, I don't think it will happen, but of course, as you said, it might have a very high impact. But I would also argue that there's a very good chance that if something like that happened in the Taiwan Strait, Europe would be in the situation that it would have to deal with also another high-risk scenario on the continent. So that would be, again, a little bit of perfect security storm. Would you agree?
I would agree. And there are a lot of interesting things that come out of doing a survey like this. For example, there is a greater likelihood of China aggressing Taiwan across the Taiwan Straits than there is of the United States and China getting into a direct military conflict, which raises interesting questions about what our experts are thinking about the strength of the United States security guarantee to Taiwan in that case. Because if the security guarantee were as strong as American policymakers claim it to be, then the likelihood that China would invade Taiwan should be exactly the same as the likelihood that the United States would get into a conflict with China, but it's not. And so I think there are things that we can see from this data that help us better to understand where experts have their doubts about how these different scenarios are linked.
There is one risk I feel is a bit missing, at least explicitly, from the project, and that I would place somewhere between moderate and high risk. I mean, efforts at least by some elements within the US administration and their allies to destabilize the European Union and support anti-EU political forces. And I think that we can also talk about the new national security strategy that is somewhat related to this. So are you concerned about such a scenario?
I think we should all be concerned about such a scenario, not least since J.D. Vance, as Vice President of the United States, spoke to the Munich Security Conference, we've known that this administration believes it has allies in Europe, but they're not the allies that most Europeans would expect America to identify and support. And that has to be a cause for concern. The fact that it's brought up again in the national security strategy is equally concerning. The fact that it existed in Project 2025, which was the Heritage Foundation's plan for what the Trump administration should do in its first 100 days in office, suggests that this is not something new. Indeed, you can go back 20 years and find papers written at the Heritage Foundation that suggested that the United States should try to divide Europeans one from another, and that extends through a lot of support that Donald Trump gave to the pro-Brexit forces in the United Kingdom after 2016. The reason it doesn't show up in this survey is that we tried to focus primarily on violent confrontation and the prospect of conflict in that physical, kinetic sense. But you're right, there's another universe of foreign policy priorities that we need to bring in. This linkage between far-right movements in the United States and far-right movement in Europe is a very prominent one, but we would have climate change and a whole cyber terrorism type thing. There are lots of things out there that we need to figure out how to get in. The difficulty is here, I don't mean to sound apologetic, but getting experts to devote their time to answer 30 questions with 2 different answers for each question is already a challenge. To get 500 plus experts, we have to contact more than 5,000 in order to get the survey to have the number it has. If we increase the number of questions to all of the concerns that you or I might have, I think the answer would be, we don't have time. and that's probably a reflection of the same reality.
In fact, we had a similar conversation a year ago when we have been talking about the political trends that might shape the 2025 at that time. And one of those trends is the destabilization of democracy. If you look back at 2025, do you see the signs of destabilization of democratic regime, especially in Europe? And do you think it might continue in 2026?
Oh, I think it's absolutely going to continue. And I would challenge the easy assumption that instability flows from outside Europe in. And I think European right-wing extremists have actually been quite adept at sharing their skills, their knowledge, their mobilization strategies with right-wing extremists in other countries. Indeed, I think the Trump administration has benefited a lot from insights it gained from Viktor Orban's Fidesz in Hungary. And in that context, I think what we're seeing is a kind of a transnational resonance among these right-wing extremist groups. And much of that is directly focused on tactics to destabilize liberal democratic institutions and to ensure that these groups can consolidate their hold over power. And I don't think there's anything I've seen that suggests that's going to diminish in 2026. On the contrary, I think it's going to intensify. And that national security strategy you pointed to earlier is a prime piece of evidence of that reinforcement, if you see what I mean.
And Eric, to wrap it up, I will quote Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico. Can we be angry at the US Vice President J.D. Vance, who said that the EU is absolutely abandoning its traditions? We cannot. He is absolutely right. If the EU continues like this and does not respect sovereign politics, traditions, and historical roots, it will perish. And if it must perish, let it perish. Does such a statement itself constitute a risk to the EU? I mean, how I read this statement is that Prime Minister Robert Fico is, because of some political disagreement, somehow unwilling to protect and defend the existing EU. So do you think this might be an internal problem for the EU going forward?
The European Union and its predecessor organizations have always faced opposition. And I think that's healthy. In a democracy, people should be free to disagree over the different things that they perceive as being important. The issues I would raise, what Prime Minister Fico has said, are twofold. First, the United States is pointing as flaws in European democracy, characteristics that U.S. policymakers insisted upon at the end of the Second World War. Specifically, European polities were supposed to be designed constitutionally to resist violent extremism, whether it came from the left or the right, and to exclude from politics and from power those political groups that either advocated violent extremism or advocated the overthrow of democratic norms and institutions. So, the idea that Europe was ever at some time a free-for-all as a political marketplace in the post-Second World War period is completely false. On the contrary, we had very tight controls over speech to prevent the return of the kinds of tragedies we saw in the First and Second World Wars. And the European Union and its predecessor organizations was intended precisely to constrain national sovereignty and to ensure that European countries learn to live peacefully with one another. So, for example, the European coal and steel community constrained the countries of Germany and France and the Benelux in their access to and deployment of the resources associated with war-making, steel and coal. And those constraints have progressed along the whole process of European integration. So to argue that European integration in the European Union was predicated on the freewheeling national sovereignty, on the contrary, it was nationally sovereign decisions that made the choice to join these binding institutions in order to find a more peaceful way for European countries to live with one another. And if we reject this European solution, we should not be surprised if at some point in the future, then all those things for which the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize are melting away. And we see a return to violent conflict in Europe, which is not something any of us would want to celebrate. So what Prime Minister Fico is suggesting is not only a complete rewriting of European history, but also a return of a form of sovereignty that Europeans have rightly rejected many, many, many times consistently over the past 5 decades or more.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.